Hello YouTube, new episode about evolving rep ranges today. We're going to get into the minutiae of the practice because I've pretty much explained the bulk of it. So now it's more of how to apply certain aspects of it in your training that can sometimes seem complicated when in reality it isn't. So today we're talking rotations, variations of lifts, and preferred evolving rep ranges for certain body part or compound movements or movement patterns. Even though I am not one to assign a strict absolute rule of thumb for a certain movement, I do think that certain applications of evolving rep ranges are going to make much more sense. And I just want to dismiss certain fears or myths that could arise surrounding the application of them because I already see that with static rep ranges. So of course it's going to happen also for the evolving kind. So let's start with this. Is there a certain level of intensity or volume that should be focused on when it comes to evolving rep ranges for certain body parts? The answer is no, because in reality, your striking range for what represents a rep range that is going to be beneficial for every single body part is pretty small, meaning that I will make a video in the hypertrophy series about that, and if you have certain concepts in this video you don't get, go check that playlist. But in terms of the perfect rep range for me, I would say between 2 and 15. That's my striking zone. That's my enlarged striking zone. When it comes to my favorite zones, I would say between 4 and 8, 4 and 10. You could even go up to 4 to 12. It's, to me, where most of the reps should take place, meaning that this is the bulk of the tonnage of the program, and then you're going to experiment higher volume for certain outliers, and you will need to implement more intensity for certain other movements. Does it mean that certain movements are going to be only in the high intensity evolving rep ranges? No, there's going to be a rotation. That's the interesting part about evolving rep ranges. Unlike a 5x5 that steadily represents the same amount of volume and intensity with a slow evolution of the progressive overload, the evolving rep ranges give you everything. That's what they're good at, that's also their issue. They evolve, meaning that the value they give to the training and the stimulus they provide changes all the time. If you do from 2 reps to 10 reps, you understand that the amount of intensity you get widely evolves. The amount of volume you do widely evolves. You go from 2 to 10 reps. That's more than 4 times the amount of tonnage you got for your first set as it evolved. And so that needs to be taken into account because as you apply it, it happens to you. You're going to experiment that. And it's going to create issues for tonnage manipulation because now you have to make up for the lack of tonnage of the higher intensity sets, and also because those higher intensity sets should be utilized to progress in weight so that the progressive overload never stops and you avoid the plateaus. So in truth, that evolution on the spectrum happens for every lift. I don't care if you're training posterior chain, I don't care if you're training biceps, it's going to be there. That being said, with the extreme comes extreme precautions and extreme applications. Certain sides of the spectrum can and should be avoided for certain movements, in my opinion. The movements that are the most demanding on the tendons, the movements that are going to recruit a muscle that might not have the best structural integrity, those ones should be more skewed towards the volume part. I don't really want you to see, I don't want you to apply a 2 rep max for your biceps. An evolving rep range of 2 to 5 reps for biceps to me makes very little sense, unless you milk the negative, in which case you're not really doing a 2x5, you're doing a 4x10, because in reality you're doing 2 reps. That needs to be avoided, because I will make a video about it, but injuries usually occur when you reverse the negative into the positive. And for something like a bicep movement with a tendon that is, yes, resistant, but still a quite frail structural thread within the body, it needs to be preserved. You need to treat it a little bit more nicely and kindly. So for a bicep, I will see something that is going to stay within a 4 minimum rep of 4 all the way up to 12. But just because the bicep needs to be preserved a little bit doesn't mean that you need to only do high volume for it. A lot of people make that mistake. They know that the mentality I just described is correct, and therefore they just do high volume and they never push the intensity and they end up doing a lot of junk volume. It needs to be avoided as well. On the flip side, certain movements are going to greatly beneficiate from higher intensity and that is going to be, for the most part, your compound movements. The movements where so many joints are involved that the ability of the body to move the weight is not really going to be compromised as much by the failing of one joint. That could be an issue because it means that another joint is going to have to compensate for that. That's form breakdown. But that's something I already discussed. You need to avoid that as well. But it's easier on something like a compound because you have more control. And on the compound, it's really going to be up to personal preferences. Some people will make intensely magnificent gains on something like a 2 rep max on the bench. Some people will be able to push it on a 2 rep max for the squat. I'm the type that can do a 2 rep max on the deadlift, have zero lower back pain, get immense amounts of tonnage, and see an amount of progression that no other lift can match. It's up to you. But those are the lifts that can really exist in that range. And on the other hand, because they exist so well in that range, it also means that they are going to have a tough time existing outside of it. Meaning that, wow, that's really raining now. Meaning that on something like a deadlift, for example, I don't want to see you doing a 12 rep max. There's no point. Not with a standard style deadlift. It's too much. And the lift is going to limit you also because your cardiovascular endurance and your structural integrity is going to be the limiting factor much more than your muscular strength. So stay with the intense rep ranges. You don't have to do 2 rep maxes, but you can stay between, I would say, 2 and 5. For something like the squat, you can stay between 3 and 8, 3 and 6. It's up to you, but those are the two extremes. And because they are extremes, they also exist in the middle. And you can discuss that in the comments if you want. If you have a certain lift that you want to know where it belongs, you can ask me. But for something like partials, for example, I would always stay within high reps. Meaning that a lot of people do the opposite. They see partials as something that can allow them to move a lot of weight, so they do high intensity. I don't like that. It's an approach that is counterintuitive for what partials should be used for. So I like to do high reps. A lot of my philosophy is surrounded by that. You can make your own approach to it, but that's just the way I think about it. So that was for the application of the evolving rep ranges to the movement patterns. Now, let's talk about what we do for the variations and the rotations. Because you might have a program that is going to be evolving with time, just like your rep ranges, and you're trying to assign a rep range. But then you quickly realize that when the variation comes into play, during the workout or during another workout, when there is a rotation of the day, meaning that you have a day A and day B, which is a technique I will explain to you how to implement so that you can have a day A and day B and you don't have to have a week A and week B. The question is, do you keep the same rep range? And the answer is no. Across the board, you will scarcely be able to keep the same rep range because a rep range is married to a lift. And that's super important. When you program, as you write the lifts that you want to implement, even before you put them into action in a day, you need to know what rep range am I going to do with this. Then you put it in the day and you try to see if it matches the other ones, because a day should be a mixture of intensity and volume across the board. I am personally opposed to the idea of intensity day, volume day, because you end up doing too much of that value and therefore you're shooting yourself in the foot, because you could be getting both of the values in the same day because they complement each other. That's the issue. Intensity plus intensity is not complementary because the intensity should be for progression. So you're shooting yourself in the foot because the second movement is not going to wield as much progression. Volume and volume is an issue too, because volume is to push tonnage and drive hypertrophy and accumulate that work. But you're limiting yourself again because you have already done that within the first few sets. You want a mix of both. And the way it exists within the program, for me, my intense work I call strength work. And then what comes afterwards can be a mixture of intensity and volume. For me, for the most part, it's volume. I do all of my low rep ranges as the opener of my workout, and the rest is full volume. That's me. That's because my body responds incredibly well to that. I have a great core capacity. I have a good ability to go back to baseline. You might be different. You might be the type that will need 2 movements with more intensity focused and then only 1 with volume. Whereas someone like me does 1 for intensity and 2 for volume, sometimes even 3. So that's up to you. That's up to your personal preferences. But it's a balance that needs to be struck. And now you understand also that even within the parameters of something that is just an intensity block within a day, okay, it's not a monthly block, it's within the day, the parameters change because the rep range evolves. So the intensity cursor could be here, it's high intensity, but it's going to be doing this. Okay? I don't even know if you can see my hand here, I hope so. It's going up, basically. And the second set is more skewed towards volume, so it's here in terms of intensity, but it still does this. Okay? So you see the problem here, because if that guy here is here, you don't really want that guy to be here, because it still represents too much intensity. If possible, you would want the intensity set to be here at the lowest when the volume is at its highest intensity, so that it complements the loss of tonnage that happened here. When the tonnage grows here because the evolving rep range bolsters the rep number, this can go down. This can be a complement now, more of a back off. And that's the nature of strength work. It's the nature of evolving rep range as well. The goal is to accumulate tonnage. And therefore, the way the sets and the exercises interact and communicate with each other is key, because it's the very point of those things, so that you can progress forever, stay tonnage stable. That's the issue that a lot of novices with evolving rep ranges will find. They will struggle to do that, but you will find that with logic dictates that if you look at volume and intensity, that relationship will have to be there, because if it's not there, you're going to just not progress. Something is going to happen. You're not going to be able to perform the way you should. Why? Because you mismanaged an aspect of evolving rep range that needs to be under your control 100%. But once it's under your control, it's fully flexible. It opens an amazing ability to actually control volume and intensity, because you can dictate the way the reps evolve. Of course, you are not the one who say on that day I do 6 reps. The program says so, but you are the one who set the day to say, if I got 5 reps last week, I'm getting 6 now. So it's still technically you doing that to yourself. You could punish yourself if you don't know what you're doing. So be careful. So now it's established within the days that there's already that variation within a set. What if you add another set? What if that verticality of the volume and intensity manipulation also exists horizontally with a different variation that is supposed to communicate with that lift or even replace it if it's a rotation? What do? You think of it as a different entity altogether. You have to apply the things that I talked to you about in the opening of the video. You have to decide the rep range for that lift, but you have to keep in mind that if it exists within the same day as another lift that is similar in the line of specificity, it needs to make sense. If you do something like, let's say you take it up a notch and you're going to do 3 sets of 3 to 5 on the deadlift, as heavy as you can. I think that putting a Romanian deadlift in the same day, an 8 to 12, is completely wasteful. And you might tell me, well, that's high intensity and that's high volume. Didn't you just tell me that it needs to complement each other? Yes, but now you're doing the same movement. So it's an issue, right? I don't want people to think that tonnage accumulation means doing as many movements as you can for the same body part. You do the movement enough so that the ability to go back to baseline for that movement is shot. Doing a deadlift and a deadlift variation is not going to be conducive to that. So the problem most of the time for people who don't manage their evolving rep ranges was the exercise selection in the first place. And the way to counteract that, in my opinion, is to look at the way it works with a rotation, because with a rotation, now the tonnage is not cumulative, it's replaced. So the tonnage of the deadlift in my example can be replaced by the tonnage of a Romanian deadlift. And you will see that to make up for the fact that you're not able to move as much weight on the Romanian deadlift, you need to do more reps to accumulate the tonnage. And when that occurs, that makes a lot more sense. You will see also that technically, because they're not existing in the same day, you are still doing something that I described where you're doing high volume to complement something that's high intensity, but they're not in the same day, so how give? Well, tonnage exists as a form of ghost, meaning that if you have rotations and a rotation occurs, you have ghost tonnage now, meaning that there was tonnage that was supposed to be there. So it's up to you to replace it with something, and it needs to be replaced with a movement that targets the similar muscles. There are advanced applications of rotations that can select a completely different movement, but that would mean that you're not trying to work that muscle group, meaning that technically it's a completely different day. So that's a different story. But in terms of applying evolving rep ranges, that's the way you need to think about it. Every single lift has its own evolving rep range that needs to be thought out for that lift, And once that is done, it needs to be implemented in the day, and it needs to be first computed against the other movements of the day to make sure that volume and intensity are balanced, and taking into account with the line of specificity how many lifts that resemble that movement pattern do you have, what are the rep ranges like, and also if it's a rotation, can it replace ghost tonnage? So now that's been established. Any questions you might have, let me know. I might run a big evolving rep range Q&A at some point. The topic still needs to be defined. I still have a lot of things to say about it. So any curiosity you might have, anything that you want to see detailed more, let me know. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for watching and have a good day.